My name is Lena, and 3 months ago I made a vow to myself that I intended to keep for the rest of my life. I was done with love. Completely, permanently done. Not the soft, dramatic kind of vow people make in movies, the kind they abandon the moment someone charming smiles at them. I mean a real vow, built brick by brick out of humiliation and betrayal, the kind you carry in your body long after you've stopped talking about it out loud. You have to understand what led me there, because none of what happened at my mother's gate makes sense without it. I was engaged for 2 years to a man named Marcus Reinhardt, a man I trusted with absolutely everything. My heart, my future, and eventually a stake in my father's logistics company, which I had personally convinced my father to give him after we got engaged. My father liked him. Everyone liked him. Marcus had this particular gift of making people feel important in his presence, the kind of charisma that made you forget to ask the questions you should have been asking. 2 weeks before our wedding, I discovered that Marcus had been quietly siphoning company funds into an account registered under his sister's maiden name for over a year. Almost 400,000 euros moved in small, careful increments, designed never to trigger an audit flag. I didn't find out from him. I found out from our accountant, an older man named Herr Kessler who had worked for my father for 2 decades, who mentioned it to me casually over the phone, assuming I already knew, assuming that of course the fiancé would be told before the accountant. I remember standing in the hallway outside my father's office in Munich, holding a printed bank statement with numbers on it that didn't belong to any life I recognized, feeling the floor tilt beneath me the way it does in dreams right before you fall. I confronted Marcus that same night. He didn't deny it. He simply looked at me with an expression of mild, almost bored disappointment, as if I were the one who had made a mistake by finding out. He told me the money was temporary, that he'd intended to pay it back before the wedding, as though that made any of it acceptable. I pressed charges the following week, against my father's initial hesitation, because my father, even then, kept saying maybe there's been a misunderstanding, maybe we should talk to him first. I was the one who insisted on the police report. I was the one who sat across from a detective and explained, in careful, unemotional detail, exactly how the money had moved. After that, I did what felt like the only reasonable thing left to do. I broke the engagement in a 2-line message I never sent. I simply stopped answering his calls. And I packed up the apartment we had shared in the city and moved back into my mother's house on the outskirts of Munich, telling myself the whole time that it was only temporary, just until the legal proceedings against Marcus were finished and I found my footing again. That was 3 months ago. In those 3 months, I hadn't let a single new person get close to me, not the postman who tried to make conversation about the weather, not my mother's neighbor, a widower who waved a little too eagerly whenever I walked past his fence, and certainly not any man who so much as looked at me for longer than a polite second. What I didn't expect, what nothing in those 3 careful, guarded months could have prepared me for, was that everything would begin to shift on an ordinary Tuesday morning, because of the new gatekeeper my mother had just hired for the property. I noticed him first for a strange, almost silly reason. The old iron gate at the front of my mother's property had been groaning on its hinges for as long as I could remember, a sound so familiar it had become part of the house itself, something you registered the way you register your own heartbeat, without really hearing it anymore. That Tuesday morning, the gate swung open without a single sound, and the absence of that familiar noise was what actually pulled me out onto the terrace in my robe, hair still damp from the shower, absolutely not dressed to be seen by anyone. There he was, kneeling by the gate post in a plain gray work jacket, carefully oiling the hinges with a small brush, sweat already on his brow, even though it was barely 7 in the morning, and the air was still cool. He must have heard the terrace door, because he looked up almost immediately, and for a fraction of a second before his expression settled into something polite and neutral, I caught something else in his eyes, a kind of quick, assessing alertness, the look of someone taking in every detail of a room before deciding how to act in it. "Guten Morgen," he said, standing up straight, wiping his hands on a cloth tucked into his back pocket. His voice was calm and low, carefully measured, nothing like the loud, overly familiar greeting I usually got from Herr Brandt, our old gatekeeper, who had retired the month before after almost 20 years on the property and who used to shout hello from halfway down the driveway. I muttered a quick greeting in return and turned to go back inside. embarrassed to be caught looking anything less than composed even on my own mother's land. Old habits from a life where appearances had mattered enormously. But something made me pause with my hand on the door. It wasn't only that he was handsome, though he undeniably was, tall with the kind of quiet, contained posture of someone used to standing at attention. It was the way his eyes had moved in that first glance, not lingering on me the way most men's eyes did, but sweeping instead along the fence line, the driveway, the tree line at the edge of the property, almost like he was checking something rather than simply noticing his surroundings. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself 3 months of suspicion had turned me into someone who saw threats in ordinary gestures. I asked my mother about him over breakfast, trying to sound casual, stirring sugar into coffee I didn't actually want, just to have something to do with my hands. "Jonas," she said, smiling in that knowing way mothers have, the kind of smile that makes you immediately suspicious they've already noticed something you haven't said out loud yet. "Very hardworking." He came asking about the position, the exact same week Herr Brandt announced he was leaving, almost as if he already knew before I'd even posted the listing anywhere. Strange coincidence, but his references were excellent, so I hired him on the spot. Almost as if he already knew before I'd even posted anything. That single sentence sat in my chest for the rest of the morning, the way a small stone sits in your shoe, impossible to ignore no matter how much you try to walk normally around it. I told myself there were 100 innocent explanations. Word of mouth. A friend of a friend who worked nearby. Small towns and small staffs talk. By afternoon, I found an excuse to walk out to the gate again, telling myself, unconvincingly even to my own ears, that I needed to check whether a delivery had arrived. Jonas was standing near the gatehouse, and he wasn't resting, wasn't reading, wasn't doing any of the small, idle things gatekeepers do between tasks. He was studying a folded piece of paper, something handwritten from what I could see, and the instant he heard my footsteps on the gravel, he folded it quickly and tucked it into his jacket in one smooth, practiced motion. Quick, economical, the kind of movement someone makes when they've had a great deal of practice making things disappear before anyone else can see them. "Everything all right?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended, old instincts from the last 3 months rising fast and hard to the surface. "Just checking the delivery schedule," he said smoothly, gesturing toward a clipboard hanging on a hook by the gatehouse door, a clipboard that clearly hadn't been touched. The pages were still perfectly aligned, no pen resting nearby, nothing about it suggesting recent use. I glanced at the clipboard, then back at him, and something cold settled in my stomach. The lie was small, almost forgivable. The kind of harmless fib that, 3 months ago, I might not have even registered as a lie at all. But I wasn't the same woman I had been 3 months ago. I noticed everything now. I had trained myself to notice everything, the way you train yourself to flinch after touching a hot stove. "You're new here," I said carefully, watching his face rather than his hands this time. "Where did you work before this?" "Different places," he said, his tone perfectly pleasant. "Mostly private properties. I move around a lot." His answer was polite, complete in structure, and told me absolutely nothing real at all, which I noticed immediately, because it was almost word for word the kind of answer Marcus used to give whenever I asked about business trips that I later learned had never actually existed. I should have walked away right then. Some sensible, self-protective part of me screamed that I should walk away right then, go back inside, lock the door, and never think about the strange new gatekeeper again. Instead, I stayed at that gate for another 10 minutes, asking careful, sideways questions, watching him deflect every single one with the same smooth, practiced ease, and telling myself the whole time that I was simply being diligent, simply protecting my mother's household, nothing more. That evening, my mother asked me to bring a plate of food out to Jonas before his shift ended, since the housekeeper had already left for the day, and my mother herself was on a phone call with her sister that showed no signs of ending soon. I almost refused. Some quiet, insistent instinct told me to keep my distance from this man, whose careful, evasive answers reminded me a little too much of the person who had nearly destroyed me. But another instinct, quieter and considerably more stubborn, told me that I needed, for my own peace of mind if nothing else, to understand exactly who he was, and why he was really standing at my mother's gate. We ended up talking for nearly 20 minutes that evening, standing on either side of the low gatehouse counter, while the sky slowly turned orange behind the tree line, and every question I asked, he answered just carefully enough to seem open, while revealing almost nothing real underneath the surface. He mentioned a younger sister he supported financially, but never once said her name. He mentioned a situation with a previous employer that had ended badly, his jaw tightening slightly as he said it, but he changed the subject before I could ask what kind of situation, turning the conversation instead toward a question about my mother's garden, deflecting with a skill that felt almost professional. Then, half as a joke, half because some reckless part of me wanted to test him, I asked whether he had ever heard of a man named Marcus Reinhardt. I watched his jaw tighten for exactly 1 second, a flicker so brief I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching so closely, before he said, very evenly, that the name didn't ring a bell at all. It should have rung a bell. Marcus's photograph had appeared in 3 regional newspapers the month before, accompanying an article about embezzlement charges at a mid-sized logistics firm in Munich, a story that had been the subject of gossip at every dinner party and church gathering my mother had attended for weeks afterward. Everyone in our social circle knew that name, knew that face. A stranger who claimed to have worked at private properties, all over, not recognizing it, not even for a second, felt less like genuine ignorance and much more like a very careful, very deliberate silence. The silence of someone choosing his words with far more precision than an ordinary gatekeeper would ever need to. I went back inside that night with my mind racing, running through every possible explanation, each one flimsier than the last. Maybe he simply didn't read the local papers. Maybe he'd heard the name and genuinely forgotten it. Maybe I was so damaged by what Marcus had done to me that I was now inventing conspiracies out of ordinary human forgetfulness, turning an innocent man into a villain, simply because I no longer knew how to trust anyone who wasn't one. I lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, replaying every detail from the day. The unnaturally silent hinges, the suspiciously convenient timing of his job application, arriving the very week Hairbrandt announced his retirement, before my mother had even posted the listing. The folded paper he'd hidden the instant he heard my footsteps, the tightened jaw at the sound of Marcus's name. Individually, each detail could be explained away. Together, laid out in a row like that in the dark, they formed a shape I didn't like at all. A shape that reminded me uncomfortably of the shape hotel receipts and bank transfers had formed 3 months earlier, right before my entire life fell apart. And underneath all of that suspicion, infuriatingly, was something else entirely. A small, warm, treacherous flutter every time I thought about the way his eyes had actually looked at me that morning, direct and unhurried, nothing like the performative charm Marcus used to turn on and off like a light switch depending on who was in the room. It terrified me more than the lies did, honestly. The lies I knew how to handle. I had 3 months of practice handling lies. The flutter was something I had sworn, in the clearest possible terms, that I would never allow myself to feel again. I had made a vow after Marcus. Never trust easily again. Never let anyone close enough to hurt me the way he had, no matter how calm their voice was, no matter how gently they oiled a gate hinge or asked about my mother's garden. And yet here I was, on day 1, less than 24 hours since I'd first heard that unnaturally silent gate swing open, already feeling something dangerously close to trust toward a man who had lied to my face at least twice, possibly more, within our first conversation. Something about Jonah's didn't add up, and some determined, wounded part of me decided, lying there in the dark, that I intended to find out exactly what it was. The timing of his hiring, the folded paper, the flicker at the mention of Marcus's name, all of it, even if another, more reckless part of me was already quietly hoping, against every ounce of hard-earned caution I'd built over the last 3 months, that whatever the answer turned out to be, it wouldn't be as bad as my instincts were warning me it would. I had no idea, that first night, lying awake and listening to the old house settle around me, just how deeply his real reasons for standing at that gate were connected to everything Marcus had already taken from me, or how much more I still stood to lose before any of this was finally over. If you want to know what Jonah's was really hiding, and why, out of every property in the region, he chose my mother's gate to wait for me, make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next reveals a connection I never saw coming, and it changes everything you think you understand about how this story began.